next in-person public meeting, which is going to be Saturday, September 14th from 10 to 12 p.m. It's going to be hosted at the Napa School District's high school library. I will post a link to where you can sort of keep up to date on our meetings, pending meetings, in the chat. But if anybody needs to talk with me directly, I will put my email address and my phone number also in the chat. So feel free to call or email anytime, and we can get you any kind of information on the process that you need. Without further ado, Garrett, I will let you introduce yourself and take it away. Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks, David. All right, welcome everybody to the meeting. Looks like based on our attendance, we're going to be able to keep the meeting pretty simple as one group having this presentation and some discussion together. Our planned agenda was to do a presentation and then have separate discussion times for estuarine resources and the shorelands that surround them, and for beaches and dunes and related outer coastal shorelands. I think that instead we're gonna do some presenting and we can have some discussion along the way. We'll specifically pause after presenting on estuaries to have some discussion there, and then we'll go on and have some presentation on beaches and dunes and have some discussion there. And the goal is to wrap up by 7:30 p.m. I guess just for some introductions, I'm Garrett Phillips, and I work for the Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force, and we're the consultant for the county's Goal 16, 17, and 18 project. Denise Loftman is also joining us tonight, and we have a sub-consultant that we're working with, Herrera Environmental Resources, as well. And I just wanted to double check the number of people joining us. I think this is a small enough group. It might be nice to just do some brief introductions. There's just not too many of us to do that. So if it's all right with y'all, and it's okay if you're tied up and weren't planning on having to speak, but I'll call on a few people sort of in a row. And if you want to introduce yourself, you're welcome to. And if you don't, I won't wait too long. Okay, so we'll start with county staff. You got an introduction from David Cook, who opened the meeting. Gail, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Gail Henriksen. I'm the Community Development Director for Clatsop County.
All right. And Denise from Crest?
Good evening, everybody. I'm the director at Crest.
All right. Cheryl Johnson?
Cheryl Johnson. I live out in Brownsmead, and I was a volunteer on the Community Citizens Advisory Councils as we worked through the update of the land use plan. So just following up with these three goals.
Thanks, Cheryl. Kevin Herkamp?
Kevin Herkamp, Ocean Shores Program Coordinator with Oregon Parks and Recreation.
Thanks, Kevin. Philip Johnson?
Hi, I'm Philip Johnson. I'm the Shoreline and Land Use Manager with Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, just kind of keeping tabs on the evolution of the project.
Thanks, Philip. Cameron?
Hi, I'm Cameron LaFollette, the Executive Director of Oregon Coast Alliance, the coastal affiliate of 1000 Friends of Oregon, and also keeping track of the project and how it goes along in the future.
Thanks, Cameron. Rhiannon?
Hi, I'm Rhiannon Bazor. I'm the Coastal Shore Specialist with the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and I focus on Goal 18 issues across the coast.
All right. Linda? All right. Linda, if you'd like to introduce yourself later, you're welcome to. Susanna?
Hi, Susanna Gladwin here. I, like Cheryl Johnson, was on the community update committees, and I'm from the southeast corner, the Jewel area, but sometimes we covered Seaside, and I'm a believer in the planning goals, and I'm always interested in the process around them. And thank you all for the work you do on this.
Thanks, Susanna. We have somebody with their name listed as iPhone. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sharon Klepfer. I'm a Gerhart City Councilor.
Thanks, Sharon. Okay, if I missed anyone, please speak up. Oh, Linda. Hey.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. I'm Linda Eierman. I live in Arch Cape, and I was on the Southwest Coastal Citizens Advisory Committee for updating the comprehensive plan. We worked on, I guess, goals 1 through 5, and then we updated our community plan. I'm interested in land use. I'm a retired lawyer, although that was not my specialty, but it's important. These goals in particular are important to Arch Cape and the south part of the county because that's who we are. We are that little strip. So just wanting to hear what's happening. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right. Well, let's move along with the presentation. Thanks for introducing yourselves. I think that's helpful with a small group like this as we have some discussion moving forward. Okay, so just to give you a summary of the kinds of public involvement opportunities we have, we are having public meetings, like David said, some online and virtual public meetings. We have a technical advisory committee made up primarily of city and state government and a few other technical specialist representatives. These meetings for the technical advisory committee are open to the public and posted on the county's webpage for anyone who wants to attend. Their purpose is for those members of the committee to have discussion, but it can be educational, and I'm happy to see anyone else there and to talk about the meeting with you afterwards. We're doing some stakeholder phone calls and interviews, and anyone is welcome to reach out to David Cook to ask to have a discussion with him and myself. As the process goes on, we do anticipate having at least one questionnaire. And in terms of getting information on the project, there is basic information on the Clatsop County webpage. I'm going to share the webpage with you in a moment. But basically, the idea is to gather some initial input and ideas, and then give anyone who's interested a chance to review draft products and draft recommendations that we make and give us feedback so that we can improve on what we're doing and make it better. And then we'll create a final or almost final goal 16, 17, and 18 package. And there'll be additional opportunities for the public to provide feedback on that. So in terms of upcoming opportunities, again, September 14th at 10 a.m. at the Napa School, we're going to have an in-person meeting that's going to move on to cover some more in-depth topics from what we're covering this evening. This is what you might call like a virtual meeting number 1 to gather initial input and ideas. And on September 14th, we'll get a bit more detailed and into the weeds. There'll be additional in-person and virtual meetings as well after that. If you'd like to be added to an email list, I believe David is maintaining a list of people to receive notices of meetings. You could probably enter your email address into the chat or email David. And again, this is the county webpage where meetings are announced and where draft materials will be posted. So throughout most of 2024, we've been gathering information on goal 16, 17, and 18 resources, evaluating data and existing conditions, getting some initial input from the public and stakeholders. And we're moving into the next phase of the project, which is drafting recommendations or alternatives for the public and decision makers to discuss and weigh in on. And we're trying to finish the project in early 2025. So before we move on and start discussing each of the goals, does anyone have any questions about public involvement or the process? And if you'd like to ask a question, I think we were anticipating a few more people, and we were thinking that our rules would be that you could raise your hand using the raise hand button. But David, if you'd like to give any more guidance on how you want people to speak up, you're welcome to do that now.
Sure. Yeah. So, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, if anybody would like to use the raise hand function, we'll wait for a natural pause in the presentation and then take questions. Or if you'd like to, you can use the chat feature, post some questions in there. And again, we'll wait for sort of a natural pause in the presentation, and I will pose those questions to Garrett.
All right. Okay, well, let's start talking about goal 16. So goal 16 is the goal that's about Clatsop County's estuaries in the Clatsop County Comprehensive Plan. So this is the Columbia River Estuary, Nicanatum Estuary, and Ecola Creek Estuary. And specifically, goal 16 is about the actual aquatic areas. So the water areas of the estuaries, their wetlands. And goal 17, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, is about some of the land surrounding the estuaries. Goal 16 aims to protect the unique ecological qualities of the estuaries and the ways that they're valued for society and culture, and particularly for economic development, which is most relevant to the Columbia River Estuary, or at least most obvious in the case of the Columbia River Estuary. Goal 16, one of the main purposes is to ensure that the estuaries can be used for economic purposes where they're suited for that. Think about navigation, fishing, water-related tourism, for example. So the purpose of goal 16 is to protect most of the values that everyone finds in the estuaries and to strike some balance. So again, it's about the aquatic areas of the estuaries. Goal 16, following state land use planning goal 16, has three main components. One you could call zoning or management units and their policies. So this is mapping each estuary and categorizing different parts of each estuary and making specific rules and policies for those areas based on their characteristics and what they're valued for. Then goal 16 also has use and activity policies, and those are policies that are related to particular kinds of uses and activities, like dredging is one category, and there's pages of policies about dredging and dredge material disposal, installing piles, building docks, other kinds of construction and land use that occurs in estuaries. And finally, there's an impact assessment procedure, which is a unique aspect of goal 16 that I'll touch on in a moment. So Clatsop County's Goal 16 elements have not been updated for a very long time. In the case of the Columbia River estuary policies, it's been over 30 years. In the case of the Nicanicum River, longer than that. And I guess since 1992 for the Ecola Creek inventory. So the information that informed policies on how the estuaries were supposed to be used and what kinds of things should and shouldn't happen are getting, quite outdated. And it's not that, Clatsop County changes very rapidly, but changes have occurred in the last 30 years. And this plan update is an opportunity to take stock of that and think about how the plan can serve the communities better. So just to get back to the management unit policies to illustrate conceptually, there are a couple more categories than this, but with management unit policies, the county maps each of the estuaries and divides it up into different categories where certain kinds of uses and activities are supposed to be protected and encouraged, and others are supposed to be prohibited or discouraged. So in natural management units, which tend to be owned by conservation organizations or the government, where agencies are trying, or, have taken the step to own these places to protect them. There's also policies that protect them from being developed. In development management units, development is really encouraged, and particularly water dependent development that depends on a location next to the water. And other kinds of uses are discouraged in these places and oftentimes prohibited. And the idea is to really preserve opportunities in the future for the kinds of businesses and economic development opportunities that rely on an estuarine location, so that those opportunities are not squandered and lost. Conservation units, you could say, strike a balance between natural and development goals. Some limited human uses and activities are allowed that don't impact ecology too much. But the idea is to maintain and conserve natural resources in those places while allowing some productive and recreational use of them as well. So goal 16 covers, of course, the open water areas that you could imagine of the Columbia River estuary, but I wanted to illustrate that it also goes fairly far upstream into some of the tributaries up to the head of tide and mean high water. So for example, in the Lewis and Clark River, you can see this is a map on the left show it that covers the same area as the image on the right. But you look up around like Lewis and Clark National Historical Park, goal 16 covers the Lewis and Clark River here. And the main channel of Lewis and Clark River is designated aquatic development, for example. And then you can see some wetlands to the west of the channel that provide some special habitat value or have a natural management unit designation. That's what the AN stands for. So just wanted to illustrate that goal 16 includes tributaries up to the head of tide. Okay, so this is a list of the use and activity categories. Each one has multiple policies. Aquaculture and fisheries, there's multiple policies related to aquaculture to protect future opportunities for aquaculture and to prevent some ecological impacts of aquaculture, for example. And the same goes for all of these other topics here. I guess this is a example of the kinds of policies you might find. This is policy 4 and 5. I think I forget how many there are about aquaculture in goal 16, Clatsop County's goal 16, but this is number 4 and 5 regarding aquaculture. And you can see that one of them is about minimizing impacts on habitat from aquaculture. And the other one is about protecting aquaculture opportunities from conflicting uses. So I think were there any questions, David, particularly about goal 16 before we move on to goal 17? I was going to pause for a while on goal 17 after we got through that part. Nothing in the chat. Okay. All right, so goal 17 is about protecting both ecological functions like water quality, fish and wildlife habitat. It's also about protecting water-dependent development opportunities like goal 16 is. Goal 17 has some extra emphasis on protecting recreational and public access resources, and on natural hazards and hazard reduction, for example, from flooding or erosion. So goal 17, we'll get into a little more detail on the areas that it covers, but it's about areas that are surrounding the estuaries and about some areas on the outer coast as well, near our beaches and dunes and our rocky coastal headlands. So generally speaking, if you can imagine areas that are within, that are like west of Highway 101 along the coast, and north of Highway 101 in the Columbia River estuary area, these numbered areas, I'm going to go through 1 to 8, are the places that are supposed to be included in Clatsop County's coastal shorelands element. And so it's not the whole area north of 101 and west of 101. It's areas that are subject to flooding from the ocean, or within 100 feet of the shore of the ocean, or within 50 feet of an estuary or coastal lake. So think about like the lakes in the Clatsop Plains, areas of geologic instability, riparian areas. So these are like vegetated areas near streams that provide some really important habitat and flood risk reduction functions. Areas of significant wetland habitat as well are included in coastal shorelands. So you'll see that in some of Clatsop County's goal 16 maps, there'll be wetlands that aren't part of goal 16. They're really part of goal 17. And so that's the case in some areas of the county. Areas that are necessary for water dependent and water related uses. This is a really critical part of goal 17. And the county is actually required to make sure that in updating its goal 17 element, it has at least as much acreage designated for water dependent development, at least as much opportunity going forward as it has in the past. And that over time, we're not incrementally reducing water dependent development opportunities next to the estuary. Additionally, coastal headlands and areas of exceptional aesthetic or scenic quality, and notably in Clatsop County, dikes and their inland tow drains are also included in coastal shorelands. Like goal 16, goal 17 also has a mapping component. So the idea is that Clatsop County has to identify which places are part of coastal shorelands and which places are not, and have some particular management units and policies for each of those places based on their qualities, their characteristics. For example, whether or not they're suitable for water dependent development or whether they're, very high quality habitat. And like goal 16, all of these different sort of land uses and activities have a special set of policies for them. So for updating Clatsop County's goal 16 and 17, the main aspects of the project are updating the estuary and shoreland maps, reporting on potential climate change impacts to estuaries and shorelands, and recommending potential changes to estuary management plans and dredge material disposal plans or dredge material management plans. In doing this, we're basically taking a look at ways in which the county's goals are not consistent with the state's anymore, and ways in which climate change or other new realities suggest that some changes to our policies should be made. So, for example, in estuaries and shorelands, we would anticipate, based on best available information, that the timing of flows in tributaries to the estuaries will change. For example, some of the highest or most intense flows might become higher and more intense, and potentially some of the lower flows might become lower as well. So there could be some more extremes that are experienced in the future. And that has implications for everything from water supplies for human uses to water availability and habitat quality for fish, and hazards as well. We're anticipating that habitats will change to some extent and migrate as sea level rises in the estuaries. And so basically, as sea level rises, some areas that are currently wetlands might become more like permanently inundated aquatic areas. And some areas that are not wetlands might become wetlands that are periodically inundated in the future. And then in terms of the county's levees and dikes, it's a special consideration that we want to think about and get input on. The levees and dikes in Clatsop County weren't designed for sort of a steadily increasing water elevation over the course of decades. And so we want to think about how policies for maintaining and improving levees and dikes can be responsive to rising sea level and related sort of changes that are coming from climate change. So this just illustrates how when the water rises, it also goes further inland over the course of decades, for example. So some wetlands lost to being inundated aquatic areas, and some new wetlands are created. This is a map showing areas that are anticipated to be impacted by rising sea level over the next 30 to 50 years. And the assumption, based on best available information that we're presenting here, this shows areas that would be impacted by a 1.5 foot increase in sea level on top of a 1% annual chance flood, or a 100-year flood. So you could think about a 100-year floodplain and add 1.5 feet of water elevation to that. And that's sort of the extent of areas that are shown on this map. For the Columbia River estuary, for the outer coast, it's a little bit hard to distinguish horizontally or from west to east anyway at this scale, but this map depicts an almost 5 foot increase in sea level rise from the current level. just wanted to, yeah, touching back on impact assessments. This is a unique aspect of goal 16. I apologize. This is a little bit, this slide is out of order, but impact assessments are a unique way under state land use planning goal 16 that local governments protect all of the values that goal 16 relates to. So the idea is that when new development and new land uses are proposed in aquatic areas, the applicant needs to do a report that describes all of the existing characteristics that are valued, from habitat to existing navigational uses, existing public access, and describe how their development could impact each of those things, and describe how they're going to avoid and minimize their impacts and ultimately mitigate for them if they can't avoid them. Okay, so that's the end of goal 16 and 17 presentation, and I wanted to specifically pause here and ask for your all's input on a few very basic questions. These are the same questions essentially that we asked in our in-person meeting. And it's a chance for us to make sure that we're not missing some of the basics as we move forward into developing policy recommendations. So the first question that I'll ask and then invite, oh, actually, before we do that, let's pause for questions on the presentation. Does anyone have any questions on what I just covered? Cheryl, it looks like you have your hand raised.
Yeah, this is sort of a big picture question, but as we're looking at this comp plan that in some areas is almost 40 years old, I'm wondering, are you seeing areas that need to change their designation? So might there be more areas that are designated development or less? Or are you mostly seeing policy changes within the existing designations? That's a really big picture question, but does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I would anticipate that we're not anticipating like sweeping changes to the management unit designations. I think one of the most notable changes might just be the extent to which like the mean higher high water mark and the boundary between goal 16 and 17 areas may have changed over the years. And so there'll be some changes in that regard. Yeah, I wouldn't anticipate like sweeping changes to the management unit maps. And no real like patterns emerging yet in terms of, oh, we need a lot more water dependent development areas. And we found all of these parcels that should be designated development that aren't right now. So, yeah.
I have a question.
Sure. Susanna?
Yes, thanks. At some point, you were talking about sea level rise. One was 1.5 feet, which I think is realistic, but it's going to be pretty impactful. But then I thought you said 5 feet.
Yeah, so the map that I showed is sea level rise impacts that the map was created by state of Oregon, and it's been used in other planning processes for Clatsop County in the last couple of years. There's always a variety of different assumptions to choose from in terms of how much sea level rise we want to think about planning for in the future. And these scenarios that were in the map we showed you were, generally considered acceptable in these other planning processes. And so to speak to your question about the distinction between 1.5 feet and 5 feet, the map showed sea level rise impacts for estuary, for the Columbia River estuary. And those areas that were colored pink on the map were areas that are considered in the 100-year floodplain plus 1.5 feet of water elevation on top of the 100-year flood. And then on the outer coast in the beach and dune areas, that same map, even though you couldn't really see it just from looking at the map, was representing, it didn't, on the outer coastal areas, it didn't take into account the 100-year floodplain. It just colored in pink those areas that are that would be inundated by an additional 5 feet of water elevation on top of the current water elevation. And yeah, so there's just two different ways of representing it for different kinds of environments. And I think the people that were modeling and creating the maps thought that that was the most appropriate way to do it. And it's the way of mapping it that's been done in the county recently as well.
Okay.
Philip?
Just a couple of quick technical questions. One, as you pointed out, the inventories on which the current plan is based are 40 years old or more. So what data sources are you using to update the resource inventories on which the planning is based? And the second question, maybe I should know this, but when you refer to a mandate not to have any less developable land, where does the mandate come from? Explain that if you would.
Sure. So the inventory information is all from pre-existing inventories and data sources that are published primarily by the state of Oregon, but also from universities, the federal government, and they're essentially like published data inventory resources that we're pulling in to this inventory, essentially. So we're not going out and doing surveys of particular places ourselves, for example, like was done 50 years ago for the original estuary plan. But to the extent that any data is out of touch and we notice it, we won't use it blindly, and we would, also rely on stakeholders and technical partners to identify any issues in that regard as well. So that's on the inventory data. And then, can you say your second question again, Philip?
Regarding the mandate you spoke of?
Yeah, I'm spacing on the actual administrative rule, but there's basically when the state of Oregon created Goal 17, the part of the original intent of it was to preserve water-dependent development opportunities, not development opportunities in general, specifically water-dependent development opportunities for uses that depend on a water location. And the state of Oregon went on, I think, I shouldn't quote the year right now, but since the county has updated their plan, specific rules were adopted at the state level that require local governments, when they update Goal 17, to quantify the number of acres that are already designated for water-dependent development, and demonstrate that in the plan update, there won't be less than that going forward. And I can follow up with you, rule.
So that's absolute. I mean, there's no exceptions based on the reality on the ground.
We haven't looked into opportunities for exceptions, but there is the goal exception process through state land use planning goal 2. So if I could imagine if a large number of the existing acres designated for water dependent development, if it turns out in our updated inventory that they're all really high quality habitat, this would be an extreme example, really high quality habitat. There's no longer navigation channels that are being maintained to access them by larger vessels. Plans that were in the works decades ago to build a road or rail improvement for land transportation to access them didn't pan out, and now there's no specific plans to do that. And from a logical perspective, it just seems like it's not honest to say that we expect water dependent development to occur here in the future, and we're having trouble coming up with alternative locations to meet the acreage requirement. Yeah, we'd look into some way of taking an exception to it, but we're not in that position yet.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, just want to make sure. Yeah, please, Susanna. Thanks.
I think, some of what's being referred to, and it's a really long list. I was also wondering where that list might be of uses in these areas. And as your last discussion was, the sea level rise will impact all that stuff a lot. And going forward, once this update is completed in 2025, will there be easy ways that we can revisit this plan and update in the future?
Yeah, interesting question. So, updating a plan element is a substantial undertaking, and there's a lot of other parts of the Clatsop County Comprehensive Plan that the county needs to maintain and consider when they're prioritizing resources. So I'm not sure when they will update it again. There's a couple things to think about. One is that Crest and the state of Oregon are trying to identify funding for a regional estuary management plan update that would include state of Washington stakeholders, like the original plan did in the 70s and the plan update did in 1990. And so there might be another opportunity for a more robust update in the not too distant future, if that kind of funding can be secured. A couple of other areas in Oregon that recently updated their estuary management plans leaned heavily on the impact assessment process that I discussed briefly before. The impact assessment is for any new development that's occurring in aquatic areas and sometimes in shoreland areas as well. You have to assess what kinds of impacts your development will have on the local environment and what kinds of hazards it would be subjected to, what kinds of impacts it would have on public access, navigation, aquaculture, so on and so forth. And so these other areas in Oregon that have updated their estuary management plans recently have basically said that going forward in your impact assessment, when you propose new development or an activity in the estuary, you need to address climate change in this and that way. And so in that regard, it's a bit of a dynamic process where like each applicant over the years and the decades will have to use the best available information at that time on anticipated forecasted climate impacts and discuss how their development relates to those. There's other potential ways of making the plan dynamic and responsive to climate change. But we'll consider doing that as well, but it can lead to a bit more uncertainty in outcomes and how, and just, any stakeholder not knowing what the outcomes of a potential development would be in the future when you have dynamic policies and text. But the impact assessment is one, probable way that we'll deal with it.
And I see your last question on my screen. Should the county consider climate change impacts when planning for estuaries and shorelands? It's directly what you're referring to, correct?
Yeah, and I know, it's a very elementary question. In our first public meeting, the answer to the question was like a resounding yes, and we went on to discuss a variety of impacts that we should be taking into account. And so if there's particular impacts that you all are interested or want to make sure we're considering beyond some of the most obvious ones, like sea level rise and erosion, you're welcome to speak up and let us know what those would be, or if you've heard of other communities in Oregon or other places responding to climate change in effective ways. We welcome you identifying those things. But yeah, that's one of the basic questions we wanted to pose to the group. In some communities around the Columbia River estuary, when we discuss climate change, we actually hear that people don't want us to talk about that. And they don't want us to respond to climate change in the plans that we make. So with public involvement and making sure that we understand what different communities want, we always want to ask even what may seem like very elementary questions. So that we're being realistic. So thank you for those questions. Are there any particular kinds of development, kinds of economic opportunities, or places that any of you are concerned about and want to make sure that we're paying some particular attention to? This could be framed in terms of some kind of resource that could be impacted in the future or that's being impacted now, and you think the plans that we have and the policies that we have aren't serving the community. It could be about change that is occurring and opportunities that are going to be presenting themselves going forward. For example, kinds of development opportunities, economic development opportunities, or we want to make sure that we're being responsive to those and not preventing them from occurring, where our accepted state land use planning goals and Clatsop County goals say we're supposed to accommodate water dependent development. Or are there places that you have any particular concerns about?
Hey, Garrett, we have a question in chat asking, are FEMA changes, which are coming this year, being taken into account as part of this goal update process?
Yeah, so we're tracking that process. FEMA changes, there's both changes to how floodplains are going to be administered. That's what a lot of people refer to as like the biological opinion, or if you've heard of the BIOP, there's going to be different requirements in the future for how development can happen in floodplains. And the goal of those is specifically to protect endangered fish and wildlife habitat, really a focus on fish, but other wildlife too, potentially. And there's that creates some additional redundancy in some ways with some of the goal 16 and goal 17 policies that we have at the local level. And so one of the things we're thinking about is, okay, if there's going to be these new requirements in floodplain areas for protecting fish and wildlife habitat. Do our plan policies provide an opportunity to use that work that a developer or a landowner has to do anyway to meet the FEMA requirements, to satisfy the local requirements? Or are we, in the existing policies we have in goal 16 and 17, do we have some redundancy that's going to cause, everyone to have to do more reports and analysis that really doesn't add any value to their and our understanding of what they're doing and what impacts they might have. So that's one way of thinking about it, one way that we're thinking about it. And then in terms of FEMA's proposed map changes, floodplain map changes around the Columbia estuary, we're using the existing adopted 100-year floodplain maps as the input to our goal 17 and goal 18 mapping. So there is some discretion that the county has to use any defensible source of flood data. So the county could use draft FEMA map, flood map data, or the county could say, we're going to actually consider areas that are subject to flooding and that should be part of goal 17 to be the 100-year floodplain plus 1.5 feet for sea level rise. And at this point, we're using just the existing adopted 100-year floodplain as our input to the goal 17 inventory, for example. So those are two aspects, two changes, FEMA floodplain management driven changes that in some ways relate to what we're doing here, and a couple ways that we're thinking about it. Okay. Well, we haven't touched on goal 18. These are some great questions. So before we move on to talking about goal 18 and beaches and dunes, is there anything else that y'all want to ask or talk about here related to estuaries and shorelands?
And I'll add, if anybody thinks of anything later or after this meeting, you're welcome to call Clatsop County Community Development staff or email me, and I can either answer your question or get it over to Garrett for answering.
Okay, so goal 18 has a major hazard and public safety element to it. It is also about protecting public access and public recreation in beach and dune areas. You could imagine, I guess, just as a reminder, that goal 18 applies to beaches and dunes, including vegetated dunes, all along Clatsop County's outer coast. The rocky headlands are covered by goal 17 rather than goal 18. Yeah, we'll dive in here a little bit more. So there's an illustration of very conceptual goal 18 areas. So Clatsop County's goal 18 element is really relatively simple and short compared to goal 16 and 17. If you visit the county's webpage, the webpage that's earlier in the slide deck, and review some of the documents there, the existing plan documents. The beaches and dunes element is very digestible compared to the other ones, and short. So goal 18 applies to, again, beaches, dunes that are active and moving over the course of years. And it also applies to dunes that might, to the casual observer, might not even necessarily look like dunes. They're stable, they have vegetation. In some cases, there's development on them. Goal 18 applies to those as well. And essentially, it has a series of policies that are primarily oriented around what kinds of development can and can't happen in different dune areas based on how stable they are. And where, when, and how grading of dunes can occur. And where erosion is occurring and threatening homes or other kinds of development, where bulkheads, riprap, and other forms of armoring can and can't occur, and where they can, how they're limited, and how it's supposed to be done. So there's development siting policies, erosion armoring policies, and dune management policies. And Clatsop County's policies are very, closely based on the state land use planning goal 18 as well, just like goal 16 and 17 are. So this is an example of a development siting policy that basically says that where dunes are active and not stable, there's very little development that's allowed to occur there. Because it wouldn't be safe to do so, and it would introduce a host of problems where you'd have to be grading the dunes to keep sand from inundating your development, or your development would be unstable, or subject to flooding. And so this is an example of the kind of policy that's in goal 18. State land use planning goal 18 has some very specific requirements for where erosion armoring is allowed and not allowed. So it's only allowed at all where development existed prior to 1977. And even where it is allowed, there's limitations on where and how it can occur, because it can create impacts on how the public uses the beach. It can impact neighboring properties and the erosion that they experience. And it can impact even whether there's and how much beach there is for the public to use in front of the armoring at all. And I'll share a slide that illustrates that concept a little more. There's also policies on grading and the circumstances under which grading dunes is allowed and not allowed. Basically, grading for the purpose of views is prohibited. Because the county doesn't have specific plans related to grading for views. But there are some circumstances where some grading can be permitted in Clatsop County. And so for goal 18, some of the main aspects of the project are, again, like with goal 16 and 17, looking at any ways in which the county's policies are not consistent with state land use planning goals, and considering climate change impacts. Are there some changes that we need to make to the goal? Is development occurring in some new ways that wasn't anticipated 40 years ago, where we need to create some new policy recommendations? And the project also includes new mapping of beach and dune areas in terms of dunes that are active versus dunes that are stable, and updated flood hazard mapping as well is going to be used for this the map updates here. So in terms of climate change impacts in beach and dune areas, we're thinking about primarily sea level rise, and some of the more extreme events that occasionally occur when you have sort of underlying sea level rise combined with the highest tides and storm surges and high wave energy. And that's when some of the news making headlines or worst hazards occur. And climate change can climate change will not affect the tides, but it can create higher storm surges, and it may increase wave energy in the future as well. And when you combine that with sea level rise, and water just being at a higher level, we anticipate there being more erosion from climate change in the future and more flooding. So this is just to illustrate a basic distinction of how dunes can work where they're committed to development and have development on them versus where they don't. So where there's not development on dunes already, dunes can migrate and respond to changes in sea level. They can respond to changes in wave energy and wave direction and erosion, and essentially move, broadly speaking, back and forth from east to west slowly over time, east to west, west to east. And the end result is you still have a beach that people can access and recreate on, and you still have dunes that protect areas further inland from the worst flooding. And when you have development built on top of dunes and they're committed to development, and property owners have a right to protect their homes, for example, using riprap or bulkheads, it prevents the dunes that they're built on top of from supplying sand to the beach through erosion. And that results in the area in front of the bulkhead or the riprap between the water and the bulkhead eroding without any sort of new source of sediment or sand supply coming in. And you can actually lose a beach area, and ultimately, you could have no beach in some places where this happens for long enough or in an extreme enough way. Our planning process doesn't include a unique analysis of our entire coastline and where we're really concerned about this kind of thing happening or not happening. Armoring and bulkheads is primarily something that's been happening within the cities and not the county. But to the extent that there is the potential for erosion in county areas, we want to make sure that we're giving people opportunities to protect their properties with methods that have the least impact possible on the beach and that have the opportunity to not cause that kind of erosion. And so there's other methods that are available, and we're thinking about how Clatsop County's Goal 18 policies can accommodate and encourage some of the alternative practices that are not so permanent and that don't have some of these sort of like worst case scenario impacts.
Garrett, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Susanna in the chat asked if there will be maps that show homes built before 1971, which may be answered by our staff from DLCD.
Yes, well, so we are going to be, the state of Oregon has created an inventory of properties that we're developed or committed to development prior to the deadline. And this project does not include a sort of reanalysis of that topic. So if any stakeholders bring up, real, genuine issues with that inventory, we can think about ways to respond to that. But so far, that hasn't happened. And so that information is actually already available online, and we can share a link to that with you, Susanna. It's not on the county's webpage yet or included in the county's GIS, but the state of Oregon does publish that online right now. Okay, so some alternatives to armoring include nourishing the beach with additional sand or cobble, sometimes called dynamic revetments, when you're using sort of larger cobble, not as large as riprap, that's actually designed to be able to move around a bit, and protect against erosion to some extent, but it's not as permanent and doesn't have quite as many impacts on the public beach as bulkheads and riprap do. There may be places where dunes have been breached from heavy public access use or inappropriate grading, where rebuilding the dune to some extent, grading back additional elevation and planting it with beach grass can provide some erosion protection. And then ultimately, like the moving structures or elevating structures away from erosion prone areas is another potential option that we want to at least make sure is available to people, and that it could be, there's like a pathway for someone to do that if they want to. And right now the policies don't really speak to that at all. Okay, so I can answer questions. We have, 20 more minutes. I can answer questions, and then I have the same set of questions that I would pose to you, to the extent that you don't have a full set for us. So I see we have some coming into the chat, it looks like.
Those questions, I believe, have been
those ones we
answered.
already answered. Yeah. Rhiannon posted in the chat, Susanna, answering your question, where you can, a link that you can click on to see properties that were developed prior to January 1st, 1977.
Yes, thank you. I see that.
All right. So I guess I'll go on to ask you, are there places in the county where you're concerned about erosion, for example, along beaches and dunes, or where you see dunes that maybe were thought to be stable becoming more dynamic and changing going forward? Are there habitats, public access areas that are potentially being threatened by development or erosion and flooding? Are you concerned about how vegetation is being managed by property owners in beach and dune areas? Is there mowing or grading going on in a way that might be inappropriate or not consistent with the goals? Are there public access opportunities or recreational opportunities or other opportunities that we should be thinking about as we're mapping and recommending new policies? Philip?
Thanks. I'm particularly interested to learn what places are Goal 18 eligible, but not currently developed for riprap or for armoring. It would be interesting to have that inventory to see, again, currently unaffected places that and how they're being treated in the plan.
You're interested in being able to look at areas that are at least past the first bar. They're potentially eligible for riprap, but they haven't experienced enough erosion or development in the past where anyone has gone ahead and tried to do it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
To what I have no idea what the extent of those properties would be, but they would be very interesting to look at in terms of places where shoreline armoring has a particular effect because it's actually completely changing things, not just expanding it or continuing existing riprap. So anyway, that would just be a interesting inventory.
Yes. Yeah, maybe I can maybe we can sort of call that out in a follow-up presentation and hone in on those for everybody. Kevin?
Yeah, I was just going to bring up that I would like to talk to you at some point, have offline, just about management. You brought up vegetation management, and we've been seeing some increased requests related to mowing on the ocean shore in particular, but in the dune areas, and it may be something to just look at more generically, and we can again talk offline because it's probably a deeper conversation than here.
All right, absolutely. I'll follow up with you. Linda, I don't want to single you out. It's a small enough group, though. I like to have some back and forth conversation. What kinds of perspectives do you hear from neighbors in Arch Cape about shoreline armoring, if any? If you care to share. You don't have to if you don't want to.
I'm sorry, my mute thing is goofy. Well, just speaking for myself, my property is riprap. It was a subdivision along the coast, got together back in the 80s because there was so much erosion and pooled resources. And so this particular stretch of property that is about 2 blocks long is riprapped. However, you would not know it because the beach there is so rocky. And so the riprap is buried. It's not really a concern for beach erosion so much as the shifting sands is what goes on there. You can have a rock on the beach that is 5 or 6 feet tall in a certain time of the year and is under sand, another part of the year. And so it's very difficult to find boundaries and predict what's going to happen. I would say that, in my part of the county, the biggest concern is for our wetlands. They are mostly on the east side of Highway 101. And because Highway 101 is so close to the beach, they have been cut off for decades from the tidal wetlands. And we have no protections for freshwater wetlands in Clatsop County, only for tidal wetlands. And so we have been trying very hard to somehow get that done, which does not relate directly to these goals, except that I am quite sure that once upon a time, before highway development intervened, they were all one. And so the distinction that's being made now is somewhat, artificial and dangerous, because our development is encroaching on them because we have no buffers and the like. So this is interesting, but not as important to us as goal 5.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who's joined? Maybe there's just a couple of other people since the meeting began who hasn't had a chance to share something they wanted to share. Cameron, yeah, this seems like something you'd want to weigh in on.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I believe I heard you say early in the in your materials that Clatsop County was not going to be developing new excuse me, inventories or maps, but was using existing materials from the state or FEMA or other agencies and entities that have done fairly extensive and probably much more sophisticated mapping than we had 30 or 40 years ago. Is that accurate? And I ask because the essence of a good or one essence of a good update to a comprehensive plan is better and more accurate mapping, so that everybody knows what is permitted or allowed or not in a given area. And I just wanted to get some clarification on what Clatsop County is going to be doing or not concerning making new inventories versus applying or using existing inventories done by other agencies.
Okay, yeah, so we're using established inventories and data that have been created by other agencies to update Clatsop County's inventories and maps. And yeah, the information will be better than, or it will be, yeah, it'll be better. It'll be a truer reflection of reality than using inventories that were done 40 years ago. A lot of goal 16, 17, and 18, the text of the plan elements describes areas that are included in goal 17 or areas that are included in goal 18. And staff still have to, they have to use the existing, very old paper maps, and also use some new inventory data. For example, the link that Rhiannon shared on development that existed prior to 1977, or looking at data on the presence of wetlands or flood prone areas. And in a lot of these cases, it's like the maps will just be a truer, more transparent reflection of the reality and what applies to people's properties and what they can, can't, shouldn't do, and the opportunities that exist for them. Whereas now you have these very old maps And they don't exactly reflect reality. And, they still have to use newer information, but it's harder to track down and it's not clear where it is or whether or not it applies. So, Rhiannon?
Can I ask one other thing related to that?
Yeah.
The reason it's so important is that partly the reason that you mentioned that there's a lot of new and much more sophisticated information out there than there was 30 or 40 years ago, as everybody knows. But there isn't always a requirement at the county level for new information to be integrated into the comprehensive plan or the ordinances. So you can have really extensively sophisticated mapping materials out there, but no requirement for it to be the basis of new ordinances or new restrictions or whatever. So one of the things that we hope is going to come out of this is an alignment of new requirements or the new maps with ordinance changes or restrictions or boundary changes, so that there's not a misstep, a gap in the middle that where we've got all this sophisticated mapping, but the ordinances haven't changed for 40 years.
Right. That makes sense.
And I also, Susanna Gladwin, I saw mentions cable landings, and I also wanted to add a question about that. That's a seriously important issue, as we all know from the disaster in Tierra del Mar from a couple of years ago. And how will the county be dealing with that in this whole process?
So part of the project is to create policies related to cable landings so that if anyone proposes a cable landing in the future, the county would have policies ready on where that cannot or could happen and how it could happen, what kinds of protections are in place. And we're still exploring what the best ways are to consider cable landings, and whether there's any place that's appropriate for it. But yeah, we're aware of many of the impacts that occurred in Tierra del Mar. Some of them, are more related to Goal 19 ocean resources, but there's undoubtedly lots of impacts in the beach and dune environment as well. So part of the project is to create policies for cable landings. And I'm happy to speak with you more about it as well. And make sure that we're capturing your ideas and concerns as we go forward with that.
Thanks. I would appreciate that. I think there's a lot of concern in coastal communities about not having cable landings be in the middle of residential areas on the beach. That was a major concern at the other end of the Tierra del Mar disaster. One end was the disaster in the sea, and the other end was the disaster in the residential community, and that's going to be an important issue in putting together cable policies for Clatsop County.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking at what happened there, it's hard to imagine how, just based on my understanding of how cable landings work, just how it could be appropriate to have one in a residential area.
Well, that's what everybody thought, except for the Tillamook County Commissioners.
Yeah. Okay.
Garrett, there's a question from Molly in the chat asking if Clatsop County involves themselves in wetlands banking.
I don't think that Clatsop County has set up a wetland bank or sort of facilitated the creation of a wetland bank.
Yeah,
Is there,
I'll
Molly?
agree. Not to my knowledge.
Molly, do you think that there's not necessarily for the county to do it, but do you think there's demand for wetland mitigation opportunities in Clatsop County that's not being met? And that a bank could be part of the solution? You're welcome to follow up with me after the meeting as well.
Yeah, and I'll mimic that statement now as well. Folks are allowed to if you have further follow-up questions for Garrett or for county staff, you're welcome to contact me. I'll post my contact information into the chat again, and let us know.
Yeah, that could have some relation to, as you say in your comment here, Molly, some relation to the FEMA biological opinion changes that are coming to floodplain management in most Oregon cities and counties in the future, is that there could be some more demand for mitigation opportunities for fish and wildlife habitat impacts. All right, Rhiannon?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to give a quick update about the beaches and dunes inventory maps that are being updated by DOGAMI, the Department of Geologic and Mineral Industries. Just to address that question about whether or not they'll be implemented. So they are being updated because the previous maps that were used in the previous comp plans up and down the state were from 1975. So like Garrett said, conditions change. We want to make sure that these new maps reflect that, which they do, reflect those current conditions. But we've also worked with Dogami to make sure that the categories that are in these new maps better match the language that we have in Goal 18 and in the comprehensive plans. And so that will make implementing them a lot easier as well. Just terms like active foredune versus stabilized foredune, things like that, so that it's really in line with that language already. And something that we're also doing at DLCD is making sure that we help all of our local jurisdictions implement those maps and incorporate them into our comprehensive plans. So we have been working with Clatsop County very closely, and they're on our advisory committee for that project as well, to make sure that their input is being considered and that there's kind of a in-step process there for when those maps are done, which they're just about done, and the report should be done with that as well too, so that those will be ready to go, hopefully to be put into this comprehensive plan update.
Thanks, Rhiannon.
Of course.
Yeah, the project is, very much dependent on these kinds of resources that the state provides. And this is definitely a prime example of it, where DLCD is doing, and Dogami are doing some in-depth mapping of Goal 18 areas for Clatsop County and other counties that none of the local governments would really have the capacity to do on their own, probably. So, thank you. All right, well, it is 7:30, and we're supposed to end the meeting at 7:30. I want to, extend an invitation to anyone in the meeting to, email. We'll go through David, and David's email address is in the chat. If you can open that up to have a follow-up conversation with he and I about anything related to Goal 16, 17, or 18 that you'd like to. I have some notes from a few of your all's comments and our discussion on things that I know we need to follow up on with you about. So we'll reach out to you if we said we would in the meeting. And I'd like to encourage you to come to our September 14th meeting at Napa School at 10 a.m. and to keep an eye on the Clatsop County webpage. And finally, to send David an email or put your email address in the chat if you'd like for us to reach out to you or be included on an email list. And thanks very much for coming tonight. We look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you all for all your work.
Thank you. Thanks for coming tonight, guys. We appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.